This is the chapter that pulls it all together. This is the one that talks about what does it really take to transform to a sustainable organization. So there are a number of dilemmas associated with being a sustainably managed organization and trying to transform to a sustainable organization requires, as the authors say, patience, consistency, stubbornness, resources, knowledge, and skills. That's all on page 284. And I think that's a reasonable way to characterize this. You're talking about a major change management strategy. That is, if we're talking about an existing organization. But let's keep in mind that we can also be talking about new startups. Now, some of you have commented about, that boy, all of this would be so much easier with a brand new organization, and the thought of trying to do this in an existing organization, wow, we just can't even fathom that. And I want you to set, if that's the way you've thought, I want you to set that aside. At least suspend your judgment on this, because the truth is, every time new leadership comes into an organization, there's a window of opportunity to execute major change. And of course, organizations are capable of major change. And depending on the organization, its history, its culture, transforming to a sustainably managed organization may be less difficult than some of you might imagine. In fact, it really requires, it's all about changing mindsets, at least as much as it is about changing structures and practices. And one of the things to keep in mind that when you talk about changing mindsets, all organizations experience turnover. And so as a given organization has new people come into it, and begins to transition out people who've been with the organization perhaps for a long time, that there's always potential for major change. Okay. 3 issues, though, that really need attention, and that's the focus of this first video for this chapter, are strategy, knowledge, and then finally organizational capabilities. So let's start by talking about strategic dilemmas. One of the things that has to happen for the organization is people need to think very carefully about, or even rethink, the nature of what it means to create value. So it can no longer be simply economic value. As you know, when we talk about the triple bottom line, we're talking about people, planet, and profit. And we need to have all 3. Now, getting into a debate about how do we make sure that we're giving each one exactly the same, okay, that is a no-win conversation. Because first of all, trying to ascertain the extent to which you're paying attention to any one of those bottom lines is going to depend on when you're measuring and how you're measuring and so on. The point is simply that you have all 3 in mind as decisions are made, as the organization's strategy is set. So we talk about the values, the beliefs, the strategies, the goal, all of that's interconnected. Okay, so that's culture. That's what values and beliefs are part of. And then strategies and goals, that's the strategic planning. So both culture and strategy have to give equivalent standing to the social, environmental, and economic concerns, and of course, all of those stakeholders. So we can't just think about any one of those. We have to think about all of them. And if this is an organization that has a board of directors, then in addition to top management, the board also needs to be very publicly and strongly in support of this balance. So we need to be able to walk the talk. We need to be able to say, okay, look, we're going to be paying attention to the triple bottom line, and we need to make sure that our actions align with those statements. So part of this is setting appropriate target metrics. Again, we need, and this is a real challenge because current accounting methods, they're starting to evolve so that we're able to take in all 3 elements. But for the most part, they've really only focused on the economic bottom line. And so we have to continue to push for the evolution of accounting methods, because ultimately that is what will dictate whether organizations truly focus on all 3 elements. They have to be able to account for all 3 elements. They have to be able to measure the efficacy of all 3 elements and not simply the economic piece. So one of the key questions that needs to be addressed is the issue of growth. What does it mean? And despite what some people may tell you, growth is not the only strategy that an organization can observe. It can also decide to maintain stability. It can also decide to retrench. Now, it's important that we flesh this out a little bit. When you talk about whether you're talking about growth, stability, or retrenchment, you have to be more explicit in terms of what do we mean? Are we talking about number of locations? Are we talking about number of employees? Are we talking about net profits? Are we talking about our inventory? Are we talking about our cash balance? What are we talking about exactly when we say, that we want to manage growth in an appropriate way? We need to be very clear about this. And, what are the trade-offs as we decide to grow? For example, as we decide to add to our employee base. Think about the Gore case as a great example, where they decided very explicitly that they wouldn't have more than 250 people associated with a particular focus area. Well, there's a good reason for that, and it's that as you continue to add people, you start to lose the personal touch. It's inevitable. It's not possible to retain a truly personal touch as you get past a certain number of people. So growth is not only in terms of our economic bottom line, but also in terms of the social bottom line, also in terms of the environmental bottom line. What is it exactly that we want? Now, your authors assert that integrating the three perspectives may mean that a sustainably managed organization is not a top performer, at least using sort of traditional economic-based metrics. And then they say, at least in the short run. And then they say something that I think really I would insist on evidence before I would buy into this. They say, over time, however, the sustainably managed organization should outperform CCOs and HIOs, especially if all three target areas are addressed. Now, that's interesting to me. And to me, what that sounds like is we're still trying to persuade people who are most interested in the economic bottom line that paying attention to the other two bottom lines will not harm the economic bottom line. I mean, it sounds like a rationalization rather than something that's necessarily evidence-based, or even rather than something that makes any kind of meaningful sense. They also say the goal should be to perform better than average over time. Now, if let's say that we wanted all organizations ultimately to be sustainably managed, or some preponderance of them, some overwhelming majority of them, and we in the same breath say something like, we want them all to perform better than average over time. I think if you sit and reflect on that for a few moments, you'll see that the Lawler and Worley conversation around this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Average means that, if we talk specifically about the median, half above, half below, you need, rather than saying we want to be better than the average of all the organizations in our industry, you need to set some other kind of bar, some other kind of metric, because to argue that we want to be better than average doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, especially if the ultimate goal is to have a majority of organizations, maybe even all organizations, to be sustainably managed. So we have to pay attention, obviously, to the entire supply chain. That makes sense. And the true costs of doing business, especially when we start talking about outsourcing and looking at what might be very cheap labor in one part of the world. Well, what are the additional shipping costs? What are some of the externalities that are occurring? Who's paying for the things that we're not paying for when we pay those low wages, and so on? Ultimately, as I've mentioned previously, we need an accounting system that takes into account the full and nuanced world in which sustainably managed organizations need to exist. Lawler and Worley also, and still in talking about strategic dilemmas, say that, we really need to reconcile our strategic intent, meaning that managers need to assess how much change will be needed in the levels and scope of breadth, aggressiveness, differentiation, what's all really going to be needed in order for the organization to be sustainably effective. So that's the strategy piece. Then we've got knowledge. And we're saying that we have a dilemma in that managers need to know what's going to be needed to support sustainable effectiveness from an organizational, a personal, and a behavioral perspective. And quite honestly, this is way easier said than done. We observe this knowing and doing gap where we know we should do something, but we don't always do that. And there are a number of reasons for that, some of which will be motivational, some of which will be barriers to our ability to do what we know is actually best. Some of it is lack of proper incentivization. Some of it is the organization losing its legitimacy, its reputation, as it engages in behaviors that are very different from what people expect. So we need to somehow, the leaders in the organization need to inspire people to learn what they need to do to contribute to the organization's sustainable effectiveness. So no matter where a person is in the organization, no matter what the person's role is, no matter what the activities are for which that person is responsible, for everyone is responsible for the organization being sustainably managed. Some of the consequences of this shift include some anxiety as people have to learn to cope with the new reality. They have this uncertainty, not necessarily knowing the rules. How can I make sure that I'm personally successful in this changing system? And of course, you'll have people who are all on board and people who are not on board. And you might say, well, we'll just get rid of these people. Now, wait a minute. If we're in fact thinking about a triple bottom line, which includes a focus on people, you can't just get rid of people. Okay? That betrays a sensibility that says only the people who are important to me are the ones who think the way I do. Okay? There are some serious ethical problems associated with that way of thinking. And so we really need to sort of be able to think far ahead in terms of how do we make it easy for people to buy into this? How do we make it worth their while? If we can't make it worth somebody's while, how do we help them find their bliss? How do we help them find an organization where the fit between them and that organization's culture will be better, both for them and for that other organization? Finally, Lawler and Worley talk about the capabilities dilemma. So they talk about strategy, they talk about knowledge, and now we talk about capabilities. And the truth is, all organizations, all individuals, all societies have strengths and weaknesses, things that we're particularly good at, things that we're not especially good at. And we need to make sure that we're thinking about all of the different stakeholders and what their role should be in decision making. What are they in fact capable of doing at a high degree? What are they less capable of doing? That can dictate to some extent the decision making in which they're involved. Also, again, going back to the knowledge issue, the knowledge gap, how do we get people educated and knowledgeable? If we're going to have a transparent system, for example, we need to make sure that people know how to interpret the information that they're seeing. We can't expect people to assist in decision making, to take a lead in decision making, if they, one, don't have access to the right information, and two, don't know how to interact with that information. So we're really talking about a lot of lifelong learning for our associates and making sure that we have the right set of strengths organizationally to do what we need to do so that our organization can be a sustainably managed one.